There's a question that doesn't get asked enough in all the discussions about authentic living. When you decide to be more authentic, to express your true self, to live according to your deepest values, who exactly is making that decision? Most people would say, obviously, I am. I'm the one choosing to be authentic. I'm the owner of my life, my choices, my direction. But there's something worth examining in that assumption of ownership. Pay attention to how people talk about themselves. I need to find myself. I have to discover who I really am. I'm working on being true to myself. There's an interesting split in that language. There's an I that's searching and a self that's being searched for. An I that needs to be true to something called myself. Which one are you? This isn't just semantics. When you sit quietly and observe your own thinking, you might notice something strange. There's a part of you that watches your thoughts, that observes your reactions, that seems to exist at a different level than the thoughts and reactions themselves. You can be angry and simultaneously watch yourself being angry. You can be lost in worry and then suddenly step back and notice you're worrying. Something in you can observe the very processes that you typically identify as you. So when people talk about being authentic, about being true to themselves, which layer are they referring to? The thoughts and reactions and patterns, or the awareness that observes those thoughts and reactions and patterns? Most authenticity work focuses on the first layer, understanding your patterns, identifying your values, learning to express your preferences without apology, strengthening your sense of I, making that I more confident, more capable, more self-assured. But what if that I, that sense of being a separate owner of this life, is itself something that appears within awareness rather than being what you are? This shows up in people's actual experience all the time, though they don't always have language for it. Someone will say, I don't know where that came from. I wasn't thinking, I just knew what to do. It flowed through me. In those moments, the sense of being a separate doer temporarily drops away, and something else operates. Not something foreign, not something external, but something that doesn't match the usual sense of I am the owner making decisions. There are traditions that talk about this as two centers of consciousness, one that thinks it's running things, one that actually is. And when the first one discovers the second one, there's often a moment of shock or even fear, because suddenly the carefully constructed sense of I'm in charge, I decide, I own this life, reveals itself as partial. So when the authenticity movement tells you to be true to yourself, there's an unexamined assumption. The assumption that you know which self you're being true to. The patterns and preferences and defended positions that say, this is me. Or the awareness in which all those patterns appear. Most authenticity work, if we're honest, strengthens the first one, makes it more defined, more defended, more capable of asserting itself, which isn't wrong. That has its place, but it might be like a wave trying to walk away from the ocean. Once you start looking, you notice there's an entire industry built around this. Courses on authentic living, workshops on finding your true voice, coaches who specialize in helping you break free from conformity and express your unique self. And something interesting happens. Go to any gathering of people who've done this work, people who've taken the courses, read the books, hired the coaches, people who are now committed to authentic living. They look the same, not physically, but energetically, spiritually. The way they talk, the way they present themselves, the authentic rebel uniform, the conscious entrepreneur aesthetic, the awakened seeker persona. All different costumes, but somehow the same performance. Everyone's authentically unique in exactly the same way, which raises a question worth sitting with. If we're all trying to be individually authentic, and the result is that we all end up expressing it identically, what does that tell us about the nature of individual authenticity? It's not that these people are being fake. They're genuinely trying. They've done the work. They've examined their conditioning. They've identified their values. They've learned to speak their truth. But something strange happens when everyone does the same work to become unique. Their bell aesthetic becomes as conformist as the corporate uniform. The person who refuses to follow the rules is following every specific rule book about how to refuse rules. The authentic voice sounds remarkably similar across thousands of authentic voices. This isn't a criticism of the people involved. It's an observation about what happens when you try to manufacture authenticity through technique. When you turn being yourself into a project, complete with steps and stages and measurable outcomes. Because here's what gets lost. The self you're trying to be authentic to might itself be a construction, a collection of reactions to your early environment, preferences formed by exposure and repetition, opinions absorbed from culture, defended positions taken to protect wounds. None of that is false. It's all real. Buticity you is the collection of patterns and preferences and defended territories, what you mean when you say authentic self. Or is there something underneath all that? Something that exists before the preferences formed, before the personality crystallized, before you learned to call certain reactions mean other reactions not me. The authenticity industry generally doesn't ask this question. It takes for granted that there's a true self buried under false conditioning, and the work is to excavate it, clear away the debris, reveal what was always there. But what if the true self isn't buried under the false self? What if they're both constructions, both useful, both real at their own level, but neither one is ultimate? There's research in quantum physics that becomes relevant here, though not in the way people usually apply quantum physics to consciousness. This is more direct. When particles become entangled, they remain connected regardless of the distance between them. What happens to one particle affects the other instantly. Not traveling through space, not limited by the speed of light, just instant correlation across any distance. The interesting development is that this same phenomenon appears to occur between conscious beings. There have been experiments where one person is placed in a shielded room, electromagnetically isolated, and another person is elsewhere. The two people are brought into what researchers call an entangled state. Then they touch one person's shoulder, and the person in the isolated room, with no physical connection, no electromagnetic signal, shows a measurable physiological response, as if their shoulder had been touched. This happens consistently, across different experiments with proper controls. It's not dramatic, it's not mystical in presentation. It's just what happens when you test whether consciousness shows the same entanglement properties that particles do. So if consciousness itself is entangled at a fundamental level, not just connected, but literally not separate, then the question of authentic individual expression becomes more complex. When you're expressing your authentic self, which consciousness are you expressing? If consciousness is fundamentally unified, fundamentally entangled, then where does your consciousness end and mine begin? The answer from both quantum research and ancient teachings is the same. It doesn't. The boundaries we experience are real at one level, useful, functional, but they're not ultimate. Ancient teachings across cultures have pointed to this for millennia. One consciousness appearing as many, the metaphors vary, ocean and waves, light through different prisms, one dreamer having many dreams. But the core insight remains consistent. Each wave has its own shape, its own movement, its own character. The wave is real, but the wave isn't separate from the ocean. It's not made of different stuff. It's a temporary pattern that water makes. When you're working on being more authentically yourself, you might be like a wave trying to separate itself from the ocean while overlooking what it's actually made of. Not that being a wave is wrong. Waves are beautiful, each one unique. But the wave that knows its ocean moves differently than the wave that thinks it's separate. It doesn't lose its wave nature. It doesn't dissolve into formless ocean. It remains distinctly itself, but the terror of dissolution disappears. Because dissolution isn't possible. You can't separate water from water. This isn't about losing your individuality. It's about understanding what individuality actually is. Not separation, not isolation, not defended boundaries, but a unique expression of something unified. Your perspective isn't separate from the whole. It's how the whole sees from this particular angle. Your experience isn't disconnected from universal consciousness. It's how universal consciousness experiences through this particular nervous system. So what does this mean practically? How does understanding consciousness as unified change the question of authentic living? First, it changes what you're defending. When you defend your authentic self from contamination by others, from influence, from having to conform, you're creating boundaries between things that aren't actually separate. Like drawing a line on water and insisting the water on each side is different. The water isn't different. The line is useful for navigation, for description, for organizing experience. But if you forget the line is conceptual, you end up defending something that doesn't need defense. Studies of collective consciousness show something interesting. As people become more individuated, more fully themselves, they often report feeling more connected to everything, not less. The boundaries don't harden, they soften. Or rather, they're seen for what they are, useful distinctions rather than absolute separations. The person who knows they're not separate can be more fully individual because they're not defending individuality. Second, it changes the relationship between your expression and others' expression. If we're all unique perspectives of one consciousness, then your way of being isn't in competition with mine. They're complementary. Different instruments in the same orchestra. Different colors in the same spectrum. The fear that your authenticity might be contaminated by exposure to mine only makes sense if we're separate. If we're unified, then exposure to your perspective enriches my perspective, not by making me more like you, by showing me an angle I couldn't see from here. Third, and perhaps most important, it changes what happens when you stop trying. There's something worth noticing about authenticity. When you're working really hard to be authentic, performing authenticity, proving your authenticity, something feels forced, constructed. But when you stop trying to be authentic, when you stop performing it, something else emerges. Not the carefully constructed authentic self, not the defended unique identity, something that just flows. Both ancient wisdom traditions and modern consciousness research point in the same direction here. Yes, you're an individual. Yes, your experience is unique. Yes, your perspective matters. And yes, you're simultaneously the whole expressing itself as a particular. Both things are true. The wave is real. The ocean is real. They're not contradictory. They're not in competition. They're the same thing seen from different scales. Maybe the work isn't protecting your authentic self from the world. Maybe it's recognizing you were never separate from the world to begin with. Every person you meet is consciousness meeting itself. Every interaction is the universe exploring itself from multiple angles simultaneously. When you stop defending boundaries that don't actually exist, something relaxes. You can be fully yourself because yourself isn't this small, separate, threatened thing that needs constant protection. It's consciousness itself, temporarily configured this way, expressing through this particular form. So where does this leave the question of authentic living? Not with an answer, with better questions. What would shift in your daily life if you experienced other people not as separate beings who might threaten your authenticity, but as other expressions of the same consciousness that's expressing as you? Where do you notice the assumption of separation creating tension? In relationships, in work, in your relationship with yourself. What happens to that tension when the assumption loosens? What emerges when you stop defending your authentic self and simply allow what wants to express through this particular configuration of consciousness? Not performing authenticity, not working to be authentic, just being what you are without the effort of being it. These aren't rhetorical questions. They're experiments you can run in your own experience, not to arrive at correct answers, but to see what happens when the questions are taken seriously. The authenticity paradox isn't that authenticity is fake or impossible. It's that the more you try to achieve it through effort and technique, the further you get from what you're seeking. While the person who stops trying, who stops defending, who simply allows their nature to express, discovers they were authentic all along, not the carefully constructed, authentic personal brand. The authenticity that comes from recognizing you're the whole universe happening here, now, in this particular form. Join One Paradox Collective as we continue exploring consciousness, identity, and the questions that change how we experience being human. Subscribe if you want to investigate these paradoxes with us. We don't promise answers about who you really are. We promise better questions. See you in the paradox.